Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us.
Hey there, folks. You're probably used to hearing Dwayne right about now, but we ran really long on our 1986 episode, and so this is part 2. If you haven't already listened to our first episode on 1986, where we cover the comics year and the year in Marvel overall, you can go back and check that one out first. This one is going to be all about 1986 Daredevil comics, specifically that spectacular Born Again series.
The year in Daredevil.
All right, my man. So, we are talking a bunch of Daredevil this year. What is it that you phoned for us as far as what Daredevil's been up to, and what do you want to talk about?
So Daredevil had a lot of appearances this year, but really there is one set of books that we're really needing to talk about, and it is part of the main Daredevil run, which this year encompasses issues 226 to 237. And about half of those being that Born Again run that we talked about a little bit earlier, that we'll get into a lot more detail on later on. But besides that, he was in Spectacular Spider-Man 110, Amazing Spider-Man 277, the Marvel Age Annual, whole bunch of other stuff. The Elektra series that you mentioned for Epic, as well as his own graphic novel, which I was not able to read, unfortunately, because it's not in Marvel Unlimited. Now, as far as writing credits, this is the year that Frank Miller came back to Daredevil for the first time in a couple of years, since we saw him leave a few years ago. So he starts off co-writing with Denny O'Neil in 226, and then it is him 227 to 233, and then we had a host of authors with writing credits after that. David Mazzucchelli was the penciler across that Born Again run, as well as that first issue of the year. We also saw Steve Ditko do some books, Barry Windsor Smith, and then Lewis Williams, excuse me. And then on inks, Denny Janke, David Mazzucchelli, Klaus Janson, Danny Belandi. Windsor Smith did inks on the book that he penciled, along with Bob Wycheck. And then Al Williamson and Danny Belandi finished out the year on issue 237. As far as what happens in that main Daredevil run, the year begins with Frank Miller returning to the title, and a story where Daredevil helps Gladiator save Betsy Beatty after confronting him stealing from a museum. And it turns out Gladiator doesn't really actually want to be stealing anything, but he's kind of being blackmailed into doing so because his love interest is being kidnapped. And so it's a really interesting story and a good story to start off the year. But it's nothing compared to what we see next, because Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli start that iconic run of books that you've probably heard of, Born Again, that starts with issue 227 and finishes with 233. And this incredible set of books there's nothing else that we should be talking about as far as the spotlight. So we have a supersized spotlight this week in which we're going to talk about that entire Born Again run, because there is just a lot there that we should talk about. After Born Again, though, we get 4 standalone stories by 4 different writers to finish off the year. The first is against this weird hero named Madcap who spouts nonsense and seemingly can't be killed. Next, we have Daredevil taking on Mr. Hyde yet again. Then we have Daredevil and Black Widow teaming up to track down another deranged member of a super soldier project. And then finally, Daredevil takes on Claw, who's looking to reestablish himself by taking down our hero. So, bunch of interesting stories. Like I said, different writing credits that are out there, different artists, all that sort of thing. But there was a weird name on issue 237, and it is John Harkness. Now, Dan, you told me that's not a real person, is it?
That is a pseudonym, because evidently Steve Englehart, who I love Steve Englehart, he's done all sorts of awesome stuff. He was going to take over on a run of Daredevil. He had all sorts of plans. He got everything ready. He'd started writing. He'd written the first issue, which has a bunch of hooks into like other story he's going to want to tell.
Okay.
And evidently Ann Nocenti was editing Daredevil at that time, or was one of the editors, and she said, I've always kind of wanted to write Daredevil. And somehow she got the job, and he didn't ever end up writing any more stories. So editors can do this, I think, if they want to, technically. But in any case, evidently they could at Marvel anyways. So Nocenti took over, which you're kind of into the midst of reading some of those, and you're probably not complaining about her being on them at this point.
No.
There's some good stuff to come.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he was the one who was going to write it. They ended up taking his name off because he's like, well, I'm not going to finish this. I don't want my name on something that goes nowhere. So they took out some of the things that were specifically leading towards other like plot points, made it more of a standalone, and replaced his name. So that is a Steve Englehart story, kind of.
a pared down story, maybe.
Pared down, yeah. Kind of weird.
All right.
So would have been fun to see what he could do, but I mean,
yeah,
we did well anyway.
Yeah. So what about those? What about that epic line of books, the Elektra Assassin book, and then what have you actually have read the Love and War graphic novel? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. So the thing about those is, first off, they are oversized, so they're not the size of a regular comic, right? And they are higher priced. So this one was $6.95, and it came out in 1986. Essentially, it's called Daredevil, Love and War, and it really isn't a Daredevil story. It almost exclusively really is a Kingpin story. And what it is, it's a story of how the Kingpin at the beginning of this story is sitting there looking at his wife, who's still sort of comatose or semi-lucid. Because if you remember, she had kind of a construction site fall on her, and then she got stuck in the sewers with that weird guy who abducted her. And she's not really recovered since. So Kingpin, because he's normal, decides that instead of hiring a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help her, he's going to kidnap the psychiatrist's wife and hold her until his wife is better. So until Vanessa, in other words, is fixed, he's like, I want you to also feel that your wife is in threat, and I want you to be as invested in this as I am. Because that's what the Kingpin would do. Yeah. Yes. So, worst guy to work for ever. But in any case, Daredevil then sets about trying to find and help the wife of the psychiatrist, because the person that was hired was really a sketchy, on drugs, might be sexually assaulting her soon dude. A lot of the imagery that Sienkiewicz does is really sort of deranged, and it's messed up. At the end of it, Vanessa actually essentially spells out with blocks that she wants to escape. And what the Kingpin realizes is that his wife is not just not recovering, she's not recovering because she's in an environment where she's terrified of him and doesn't want to be. So he puts her on a plane along with a blank check and the psychiatrist and his wife, who Daredevil has saved, and she goes off to Europe with a new identity to start a new life. And this is, in other words, important to the Marvel Universe, or to the Daredevil universe, though, because this is how Daredevil loses his wife, or because this is how Kingpin loses his wife, and you don't see it just reading the regular comics because it's tucked off in a graphic novel.
Yeah,
so,
no, there's some important things that end up happening under Nocenti's watch that that would have been nice to know about prior to reading some of those things. So yeah, they're to my knowledge, I don't recall there being even a mention of the fact that Vanessa is no longer in the picture next year, like in 1987, in any of the like regular books.
But she's not dead. She actually has gone away to Europe and is sitting there like a little unexploded plot bomb, just waiting to go off whenever they need her. So just keep that in mind.
Why would that be relevant, Dan? It's not like that's going to happen in Born Again or something.
We'll see. We'll see what happens. So, but
what about Elektra Assassin?
Elektra Assassin is, my notes say it's completely batshit, and I think I stand by that. It is one of the weirdest comic books you will ever read. It is beautiful. It's fully painted by Bill Sienkiewicz. Miller does the story. The two of them just sort of seem to get weirder based off of the other one as they go along. The whole thing is wildly experimental. It was 7 issues through Epic, so they could do it and do additional sort of content that wouldn't need to or wouldn't be allowed otherwise. Elektra is essentially paired with a cyborg who wasn't originally a cyborg, but he kind of gets blown up and his head gets put into a cyborg, and he's obsessed with her. They end up trying to stop a presidential candidate who looks kind of eerily like Dan Quayle, who was in politics back at that time, but Bill Sienkiewicz says is actually just a self-portrait of himself. But in any case, he's doing the will of this sort of weird mystical creature called the Beast that is sort of like a demon bear for Daredevil type of thing. And in the end, the idea is that this guy wants to get elected president so that he can cause a nuclear holocaust by starting World War III or whatever. And it's just weird. Like, there's a lot of strange sort of sexual stuff. There's a lot of strange violent sort of stuff. There's a lot of just things that don't make a lot of sense. It's still fascinating, and I enjoy it, but it is kind of a remnant of sort of... It's the kind of over-the-top thing that if you remember, like, you know, I don't know, Culture Club or something, in terms of 80s excesses in music and the like, this is sort of that for comic books. It is just brilliant colors and crazy stuff and just a cacophony of too much for the senses. So that
sounds really weird. I'm not sure if I missed that, actually.
No, I don't think there's that much there you really need to know. I mean, Elektra's in like a mental ward or something like that to start it, so she's dealing with going through some psychological problems and things like this. But I don't know there's really that much in this that you need to know to go on with the Elektra story. It's kind of almost more like what you'd hope an epic or a Marvel graphic novel would be. Something that's an interesting additional diversion if you want, but you don't need it to follow the main story.
Sure. All right. Well, as far as talking about kind of the what's new, there really wasn't anything as far as new powers, toys, and places this year. One thing I will note is it's interesting. We see Black Widow in a couple issues 236 and 237, but she doesn't actually have her standard gauntlets that she normally has. That she's been very accustomed to wearing in all the times that we've seen her. So I thought that was just sort of an interesting little thing. As far as supporting characters, there's 2 characters that I will mention here, but they're from the Born Again story. There's a woman named Margaret, who I don't think I want to spoil who that is just yet, so we will just set that aside for the moment. The other is a guy by the name of Paulo Scorsese. He is a drug dealer in this story. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail right now because it'll become important when we go through and talk about our main story. As far as new villains, we have Nuke, who you mentioned a little bit earlier. He's an American super sniper that is part of the Born Again story. We also have Madcap, who is that really weird villain that Daredevil takes on post Born Again. Jack Hazard is that super soldier that is taken down by Daredevil and Black Widow. And then, of course, Claw, who was in that revamped story to finish off the year. So not a ton of new as far as this goes, but yeah, I think we've buried the lead long enough. Why don't we jump in and talk about the Spotlight? This week's Spotlight story.
All right, Dwayne. So I noted you went quickly through the other stuff, which I celebrate because what we're going to be doing here is one of the coolest, best, and densest Daredevil stories that probably you're ever going to read. Tell us a little bit about Daredevil 227 to 233, what we call Born Again.
Yeah, we're not going to do our standard like narrative read through of this because this is like 7 books, and so it is a big story. There's a lot that goes on, but we're going to hit some of the high points like we typically do, and obviously there's a lot to discuss. And I think the very first thing obviously that we have to talk about is we have the return of Karen Page, the very first love interest from the comics. Like, the old secretary goes off to Hollywood, becomes a movie star, and she's now a drug addict and has fallen on hard times, and she's like in Mexico or something, and is like on heroin and is looking for a fix. And she actually reveals that Matt Murdock is Daredevil to one of her dealers, and that dealer just happens to be somebody through the chains of command that is working for the Kingpin. So through a telephone, we basically get Kingpin finding out that Matt Murdock is Daredevil. And what we then see over kind of the next issue or two is the systematic dismantling of Matt Murdock and his life by the Kingpin. Murdock gets disbarred. He has his assets frozen by the IRS. He even gets his house blown up. It is actually just sort of crazy, everything that happens. And throughout all this, Matt Murdock doesn't really put 2 and 2 together that this is a coordinated effort against him. He just thinks that there is a string of bad luck that is sort of happening until that kind of the house blowing up, in which case then it starts to kind of sink in that maybe there is some force behind this, and the only one that would really be able to do that is the Kingpin. Dan, what did you think at the beginning of this story? Because this to me was just amazing. I was not expecting Karen Page to come back. And then just watching the evil, maniacal dismantling of Matt Murdock by the Kingpin was it was super villainy at its finest, I have to say.
Well, and the fact that, the Kingpin gets the note telling him the name of Daredevil. And he doesn't immediately go off and just try to shoot him or whatever. He basically says, okay, I want to know everybody who ever saw this note or is in the line from essentially Karen Page to here. And we're going to kill them all once we know this is true. But for now, let's see what happens. And then it had a thing that's 6 months later or whatever. And so he puts all this stuff in motion. And he starts freezing his accounts, and he starts doing all these things to take Matt Murdock's life away from him. and drive him sort of to madness. And he gets there. Like, he defeats Matt Murdock to the point where he's lost his law license. He is at his very lowest point. He's got no friends. Even most people he knows now don't actually trust him because they think that the frame's been put in so well that they think maybe he actually did some of these things that he's being accused of. And then, where you ended it, I think is one of my favorite parts of the series, because you get to that point where he's going home and his house blows up in front of him. And exactly what the Kingpin doesn't want to happen happens, which is that he's hoping that's going to be the thing that finally breaks Murdock and just crashes him. And instead he looks at it and he sees that and he realizes this isn't just a professional frame. This isn't an accident or something, that this is personal. And he says, you shouldn't have signed your work, know? And at that point, he knows there's only one person who hates him enough to do this and can do this. And he's ready to go now, because now he's got somebody to fight. Before, the world was just crashing around on him, and there was nothing he could do about it.
Right. And what's interesting is you talked about him kind of going mad. He starts sort of kind of obsessing with people around him. He's like accusing them in his mind of, maybe Foggy's in on it. Maybe Gloriana is in on it. Maybe, all these people that are like fixtures in his life that, he wouldn't have considered as being possibly involved in this. He's like, he doesn't trust any of them. And so it's amazing just how tight in a box the Kingpin is able to put him in. And just that one little step is enough to like make him realize, oh wait, no, this isn't what I'm thinking. This is there is something here, and the person I should be looking at is the person I should have been looking at the whole time.
Yep. And up to that point though, and even then, I think that the beautiful thing about this, and some of Frank Miller's stuff later, Elektra Assassin may have been completely ridiculous and just made up on the spot and whatever, and I don't really understand it. But this is tightly, beautifully plotted psychologically.
Yeah.
The thing is that the Kingpin knew he'd won. The Kingpin knew he'd destroyed him. And he even said, I could just let it be.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the Kingpin doesn't actually win unless Matt Murdock knows it's him that's destroyed his life.
Right.
And so that last mistake by the Kingpin is not actually a mistake. It's an absolute required outgrowth of his own personality.
That narcissistic thing that he needs him to know that he's the one that did all this.
Yep. And when he does take it that far, that then sets in motion the second part of the chain of events, where now Murdock's going to come for him.
Yeah.
And he doesn't worry about that too much, because Daredevil or Murdock, now that he knows who he is, he thinks he can handle him. He may not realize exactly who he's facing at this point. So there you go.
So as we move on, Daredevil eventually realizes that the Kingpin's behind everything that's happened and attacks him head on. The result is an unconscious and badly beaten Daredevil is strapped into a taxi with the owner, who's been beaten to death with Daredevil's billy club, is pushed into the East River. So trying to make it look like kind of a murder-suicide sort of scenario. Daredevil does, in fact, escape the taxi, but ends up passing out in an alley in Hell's Kitchen, where he's found by a nun who turns out to be his mother, Margaret. And he ends up getting nursed back to health at a local church. This was a really interesting turn of events for as we continue through this, because he goes with the intention of, I'm just going to beat the crap out of Kingpin. I'm going to force him to undo all the things that he's done to me over the last time, get me back my lawyer's license, all this sort of stuff. And he basically just gets his butt kicked by Kingpin, which is, I think, exactly what Kingpin expected to happen if he came up and tried it. And then he wanted to get rid of him, puts him in a taxi, frames him for murder in case he somehow manages to get out. But there's no way he's going to get out. He's unconscious. He's beaten almost to death anyway. But he does, in fact, escape. And there's, near the end of one of the books, there is him kind of waking up in this church, and he doesn't know where he is. But he recognizes a woman's figure, and like he's met this woman before, and we get this full page panel of just this kind of portrait of a nun, this woman named Margaret, and she doesn't outright say that she's his mother, but she doesn't deny that she's his mother either, because he like mentions that he's met this woman named Margaret before, and that was his mother, and it was really, really something, and quite the way to reveal that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Basically, he can smell and just tell from all of that, and then from the cross she's wearing, he infers that it's his mother. And
yes,
we are not actually at any point in this that I know, we do not know that's actually his mom at this point. Is it ever? I don't think that Miller ever makes it actually absolute. It is all inferred.
It doesn't. Yeah, it is all inferred. We don't specifically. He doesn't specifically spell it out, but it's like, hey, my mother's name was Margaret. She went away. I remembered what she looked like before, and the cross was a big important thing. And I recognize the voice and all this sort of thing, and you are just like her. And she's like, oh, that's really nice. And it's like, yeah.
Yep. It's fantastic. And the idea, though, that also, he is at this point where now, essentially, he's dead to everybody because he's disappeared. He's off the grid in this, essentially just being taken care of at a mission someplace, and like the Kingpin thinks he's dead, thinks he's gone. He doesn't know there's anything going on, which gives him the ability to sort of start finding a way to heal himself and get ready to sort of, plan things. But it is interesting because you just keep seeing how, he's first beaten sort of economically, and he has his job taken away and the like, and now he's actually physically beaten down as well, and sort of now everything's been taken away from him. But he finds his mom, and at that point now, this is like his first win,
Yeah.
And again, we don't know for sure it's actually his mom, but he thinks it is, to the point where for him, he's now got something that's gone right for him for the first time in God knows how long. So Miller gives him that little win to sort of keep carrying on.
Yeah. So next up, we look at Karen Page, who's being hunted by the Kingpin to tie up those loose ends about who knows the secret of Matt Murdock and Daredevil. And she convinces an abusive drug dealer named Paolo Scorsese to help her get to New York, thinking that, if she can find Matt Murdock, he's going to be able to help her, because he's always kind of looked out for her, before she went to Hollywood and everything. So they get to New York, and she's not able to find him. She calls up his house where she knew he lived at one point. He's obviously not there anymore. He had moved, and then the house blew up and all this. He's still at the church. She eventually reaches out to Foggy Nelson, and those two end up meeting. And that's really sort of a kind of eye-opening experience, both for both of them, because, Foggy sees what sort of hard time that Karen has fallen into, and even sees that she's being followed by this abusive drug dealer to his apartment building and is like waiting for her to come out after they meet. And she's sure that she's going to get killed by him when she goes outside. And it is really difficult. And like Foggy is, I don't know where Matt is. I haven't seen him in ages. And we had this falling out and all this sort of thing. And he got disbarred. And so it was really, it was quite something, actually.
He got disbarred. And I stole his girlfriend while all this was happening. So I'm a little bit, you know, a little awkward to kind of go and find him now anyways. I don't really know if I want him to show up at the house because then I got to explain some things, which is exactly what happens. So.
Yeah, I did fail to mention that Gloriana, who is kind of the love interest, suddenly is with Matt off the grid. He immediately sort of is looking for comfort, and Foggy Nelson is there, and the two kind of strike up a relationship as a result of it.
I don't think any lifetime Daredevil fan can complain about Foggy getting a win over Matt once in a while, because too many times he has stolen the girl away from Foggy. So, but yeah, the other thing is right around here as that's happening, they do pull the car out of the river. And the thing I love from that is kind of like you've got the one where Daredevil's like, you shouldn't have signed it. There's a thing at the end of one of the books with the Kingpin standing there looking out over the river. He talks about how they found the car. He's like, they found it. There is no corpse. There is no corpse. There is no corpse.
Yes.
And at that point, it's the exact same thing where he's now like, okay, game's back on. Because the two of them just keep impressing each other, you know?
Yeah. So. It is that obsession is definitely back at that point. It is he's bloodthirsty, I think is I think the best way of putting it. So because of that, Kingpin goes out looking for Murdock again, and he arranges for a violently ill mental patient to wear a Daredevil suit, go to Foggy's apartment and kill Foggy. And heck, Karen Page just happens to be there because he's looking for her as well. Hey, the two are meeting. That two birds, one stone. So that happens, and what's crazy is Matt Murdock, for the first time since being kind of put into the river, ends up intervening to save them. And the result of this whole thing, and actually helps save Karen from the abusive drug dealer Paulo as well. They end up at the end of the issue reuniting and hugging and kissing, and it was quite something. Really powerful sort of return for Matt Murdock as kind of the hero in this story, after kind of being off for, we don't even really know how long it's been, because it's been like weeks, it feels like, to possibly months, because he's had to recover from the beating and the possible drowning, and he's now working as a short-order cook at a local like diner and stuff, and he's just sort of there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think this is a fantastically satisfying ending. Like it's a truly upbeat ending to a really devastating story, in that Karen is saved, Murdock is saved. They're both able to, you know, like kind of get back together. Everything else kind of gets where it needs to be. You know, Foggy's still alive. I think that one thing that maybe also is interesting to take a look at or think about is Ben Urich's role in a lot of this. I don't know if you talked about that much, but Urich becomes like almost the foil of what happens to a normal guy when the Kingpin puts this sort of pressure on. Because originally Urich was going to try and break the story to try and help Murdock avoid disbarment and everything. But I said, look, this dude is good. This is a frame, right?
Yeah.
And the Kingpin essentially is like, I'll kill everybody you care about, and I'll break you. And at a certain point, Urich just buries the story because he realizes he can't do anything about it, and it breaks him. You know?
Yeah. He actually there's a source that is willing, the person that the police officer that they got to bring up the charges that he took a bribe ends up saying he's willing to talk, and he gets beaten up and then put in the hospital, and Urich goes to try and talk to him in the hospital, and Fisk ends up hiring a nurse that ends up killing the source, the police officer, and like breaks Urich's arm, and gives him the ultimatum of basically drop the story or I'll kill everyone you know and love. And that's when he ends up doing it. It is just devastating and just difficult to watch, actually, as you're reading this. It's like he really is able to do all this, and there's really nothing anybody can do to stop him.
Yep. Normal people simply are broken by him. And I mean, Matt for the most part was, but then you get this sort of recovery arc where at a certain point, once he knew where to point his anger, he was actually able to kind of at least somewhat save the day. Obviously, the Kingpin's still out there, right? So let's hope he doesn't get angry and try anything rash.
Well, not satisfied with the attempt to kill Murdock or to kill Foggy and Karen, Kingpin then uses his pull with the military to leverage the services of Nuke, an American super soldier on amphetamines, to assault Hell's Kitchen to draw out and hopefully kill Murdock. In the end, though, Daredevil defeats Nuke and, in an uncharacteristic move to stop the slaughter, uses Nuke's weapon to destroy an assault helicopter that supports Nuke and further threatens civilians, thereby killing the pilot of that helicopter. It is then at that point that the Avengers arrive on the scene to take Nuke into custody. So this thing goes from like an 8 or a 9 DEFCON to like a 15, because you bring in this super soldier who's like doing terrible things overseas and plant him in the middle of Hell's Kitchen to basically mow down anybody and everybody to try and draw out Matt Murdock or Daredevil, because that's how much Kingpin is obsessed with him and wants him dead.
I fear he did something rash, to be quite frank.
Yes,
it's literally he's burning Hell's Kitchen to the ground, and he doesn't.
Yes,
care.
No, he does not.
He will destroy the entire neighborhood if he can get Murdock with it. So, yeah, I found this to be. We talked about this. You found this to be kind of an odd coda to the story or finish to the story.
I thought it was a great story up until this point. And it was at this point where it felt like it had gone a bit too far. Like it just, not just the indiscriminate killing by a super soldier, but like then the Avengers show up and it's like, this was already a really good story in and of itself. And this to me didn't really add anything to it. And like, I would have liked to have seen a resolution to this story that didn't involve going this way, I guess.
Oh. So we should maybe finish up the last part of the story before we talk about this. But yeah. I think it is interesting to note that really how Born Again becomes Born Again is the graphic novel that came out. They used to make them a little longer. Had 8 books in it. It had 226 or whatever, the one that sort of is a preface to it. And then it had the 5 Born Again books. and then it had these 2 Nuke stories. So there was an 8-story arc in the graphic novel that went into like Barnes and Noble and whatever. But actually, the Born Again story, I think, is just the 5 books. These 2 really are the Daredevil's Born Again in the 5 books. This is finishing the Kingpin story.
That would make sense. It just, I don't know. These are still written by Frank Miller, and they're still, inked and drawn by David Mazzucchelli. So I just sort of assumed that they should be part of that Born Again story, because it did feel like kind of a continuation of the thing that happened. But at the same time, it just is so jarring how
Yep.
far like over the top it goes, because it felt like this was a good, coherent, reasonable story up until this point, and then it just sort of goes completely off the rails here at this point.
Well, I think that, Born Again as a story is finished at the end of that last issue. When you finish 231, you've got them sort of embracing, you've got Urich ready to write his story. I think that you could reasonably decide that ends it. But Miller still had a little bit more to tell, obviously, and this is not at all... It doesn't fit in any way with what I consider to be Born Again. I don't know if you thought about it, but the 5 issues of Born Again, did you notice that every one of them has a title that comes from Christianity somehow? Because you've got like Saved,
reference, yeah.
Saved, Born Again, Armageddon, all of these, right? And every one of them starts with Matt Murdock sort of laying down or in a fetal position in a full-page spread, except the last one where he's standing up. So there's a visual and thematic continuity through it that this just doesn't have any part of. So I think this is literally just another story, but it's important because you really need to know what happens with the Kingpin and with resolving this conflict between these 2 guys.
Yeah. So to finish that, enraged by the treatment he's received in the media, Nuke breaks free from custody and attempts to attack the offices of the Daily Bugle. He's stopped by Captain America, but nonetheless, the military attempts to kill him, as do Kingpin's men. However, though mortally wounded, Nuke does not die immediately, with Daredevil taking Nuke to the Daily Bugle to prove that Nuke is a government operative and that his presence in New York is the product of Kingpin's widespread influence in the military. Mm-hmm. So that's how you're going to bring down the Kingpin. You're going to prove that he is the corrupting factor, that he was the one responsible for bringing this guy into Hell's Kitchen and blowing everything up and killing so many innocent people. And it gives kind of the cover to Ben Urich to be able to do it, to do the story and that sort of thing. And it is quite something. So the story then ends with Kingpin's public image as an honest and respectable businessman and a pillar of the community shattered, though he manages to avoid imprisonment while he plans his revenge. Meanwhile, Murdock accepts and enjoys his new, different, but apparently fulfilling life as a cook in Hell's Kitchen with Karen Page, and expresses no regret over the loss of his previous lifestyle as a successful lawyer. So there's actually kind of a full page panel of them kind of walking arm in arm on the street, and he's just like, I'm happy, I feel good, everything is back the way it should be, even though it's different than the way it was.
Yep. Yeah, the Nuke part of it is weird, but outside of that, I love the last 2 issues of this. I love the fact that it lets them reset him, and I mean, this is important also because Daredevil has been a character who's carried so much weight along with him for so long. And there is something about this that just lets it all sort of get flushed away and reset. You know, the one character who did get a complete reset in 1986 in the Marvel Universe was in some ways Daredevil, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, if this had been the end and you'd started a new Daredevil #1 next month, I think that would have been something that made sense, you know?
Yeah.
Foggy
Definitely.
becomes Daredevil, and Matt just sort of wanders off into the clouds. So yeah, it's interesting. I think these are just fantastic, and the depths of them as well. I mean, the way that it deals with power, and the way that it deals with violence, and the way that it deals with religion. I mean, we've talked about how Frank Miller looks at Matt Murdock, and sort of Catholicism is an important part to him. But I think that there's a very strong case to be made that thematically what this story is about is essentially almost like Matt Murdock going through sort of like the torments of Christ, dying, going to hell, being reborn, and even some of the things, there is no body by the Kingpin. That's almost like rolling away the stone type of thing and finding there's nobody there. There's a lot of this story that can be looked at as an allegory of sort of Christian redemption. So,
yeah, definitely. I still really love this story despite the nuke portion of it. The art is fantastic, and it matched kind of the tone throughout all this. I think Miller and Mazzucchelli worked fantastically throughout all this. The thing that struck me is just how scary the Kingpin is throughout all this. This is, to me, the Kingpin that I think of when I think about the Kingpin. And it also, to me, kind of shows just how fragile that dual life that Matt Murdock and Daredevil have. And just how easy it would be to pick it apart if you knew that those two were one and the same. And all it took was the right person to know for it to completely just collapse his life. It was quite something.
So what do you think about the fact that as of the end of these stories, the Kingpin knows, but he doesn't tell the world that Daredevil is Matt Murdock? Even after all this, he keeps that to himself. That's his enemy, and he's going to keep this information, and he's going to destroy him by himself. I've always found that very interesting. He doesn't.
That is great.
Take out an ad in the New York Times and say, by the way, Matt Murdock's the one that's been crashing around.
Yeah, there's no J. Jonah Jameson billboard story about it going on or anything like that. It just proves, obviously, one, how obsessed the Kingpin is, and just like that this is his obsession. This is his guy that he's going to take care of. Come hell or high water, he's going to be the one that takes down Daredevil. Yep. And he doesn't need anybody else's help. He'll do it on his own, at his own right. And like, he's thinking about it immediately, despite all the things that are going on. He's going to have to rebuild himself, the public image of him as an honest businessman, now that it's come out that he is, has all this sway in the military and all this. He's not worried about that at the end of this. He's worried about, how am I going to get revenge on Daredevil when it's all said and done?
Yeah. I also think, when you look at this, one of the interesting things, when you talk about how you don't like 232 and 233 sometimes, or in some ways, because they mess with the tone. The weird thing is that what 227 to 231 really did is acclimated you to the fact that Daredevil is no longer a superhero comic. Because if you think about it, some of the biggest violence is like, Foggy hitting some guy with a bowling ball and stuff like this. It is much more a story about people, and the fighting is not Daredevil in costume when he goes to face the Kingpin. It's just him as Matt Murdock going in and swinging at him. This is a story that takes away all of the superhero trappings in a lot of ways, and it is much more a psychological story of a man being beaten down and destroyed by society and by secret forces he cannot understand, and then him coming back from that and fighting his way back to reclaim his life. And then 232 and 233 are like, hey, let's have punching and superheroes and traditional comic book violence.
Yeah, let's have that big third act fight that we're so used to. Yeah. Yep.
And you're like, that's what is this? Why is there punching in my comic books? I'm not used to this. So it is weird how the out of place stuff is 227 to 231. But once you get a little of that, you're like, man, I wish they'd just have done 2 more issues of that to finish it off.
Yes.
So in any case, though, it is fantastic. Just everything about these not only gives you a great story, but the way it frees up the character for additional stories. You take so many weights off of him, and you also take some things, nobody'd ever really known how to deal with the fact that Daredevil was the blind lawyer, right? Even though it sounds like, Justice is blind, and the joke is you've got a superhero who's blind who's also a lawyer, right? That's Stan Lee's sort of weird hook that made the thing thematically make sense. But he's now lost his law license, and he doesn't get it back next month, just as a note. You've been reading ahead a little bit, and you probably have noticed he's not practicing a lot of law even years from now. So this is going to cause changes and new story options, and there's new characters around and old characters gone. So it's pretty important.
No, this is every bit the story that I think I was expecting based on everybody telling me how good a story this is. It is it is definitely one of those stories that if you hear that this is a really good story, it does actually live up to the hype of being a really good story, and definitely worth your time to read it if you get an opportunity to do so. This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, we have talked at great lengths about just a ridiculously big year in comics, a very big year at Marvel's, more specifically with the sale and the attempt at a new universe and all of that, and then just a fantastic year with a landmark story in Daredevil Born Again. What should be the takeaway that we get for if we look at 1986?
I think this is one of those, the old, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times type of things. When you look at 1986, it undeniably created some of the best stories and the best sort of like storylines in the history of comics. People adore Watchmen, and lots of people cite that as one of their favorite comic books. Dark Knight absolutely revitalized Batman. Batman for most of the last 20 years has not been the Batman that we think of. Starting with Adam West in the mid-60s, it was sort of campy, and then you'd get occasional Neil Adams or Marshall Rogers comes in and makes him cool. But Batman had been on the verge of cancellation at times in the 70s and into the 80s. It was not the cultural behemoth that it is now. And Dark Knight did that. Like, Dark Knight made Batman the edgy, cool, sort of big character of the 80s. Moe's gave comics inroads into new places like libraries that they previously hadn't been able to get into, because there were a lot of libraries that would not stock comic books because they're like, those aren't books. But a lot of them eventually said, Moe's we'll make an exception for. And then once we got our little grubby mitts into the library,
our little mouse foot in the door.
Yep, that was the outpost. And from there, now libraries have massive graphic novel sections. We got, with the Mutant Massacre, we got the first real summer crossover. So this is the first time that you got a major crossover. Like DC did Legends this year as well, but it wasn't as big. And really the reaction to Mutant Massacre was the thing that sort of consolidated, according to most comics historians, the idea that you are going to be able to sell these every year, and that essentially every summer had to have a major crossover to sell titles. We had Dark Horse arriving as sort of the first modern, what I'd call mid-major publisher. So you've got DC and you've got Marvel, you've got all of the small publishers that are trying to scrape by. But in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of Image and Dark Horse and some of these others that are sort of not at the level of a DC or Marvel, but also not really a niche publisher either. And so this was kind of the first time we started to see that there were other publishers that could rise to the level of being, if not a competition for Marvel or DC, at least a decent other option for creators and for fans outside of the superhero universes. Man of Steel, besides reinventing Superman, also gave us something that I believe has become a bane of the comic book industry. Because Man of Steel #1 shipped with 2 covers. It was the first modern major superhero comic to have a variant cover.
Oh, really?
So 1986 was the start of the variant cover idea as well. You had a regular series of cover for Man of Steel, which had sort of Superman standing off to the side, and then, or one of the main characters standing off to the side, and then a scene from what was going on in the book. But there was a second cover for Man of Steel #1 that was just a picture of like Clark Kent opening up his suit and showing the Superman logo underneath. And that sold tons of copies. They realized people would buy 2, one for the regular cover and one for the other cover, which you know how little time it takes to make one extra cover to sell twice as many comic books? They were on that immediately. So,
yeah.
So that was the new start there. And then I think that idea that even as comics were becoming more difficult to find at newsstands and in drugstores and things like that, comic stores were starting to have legislators and law enforcement come in and start checking their stock. A lot of these folks are realizing that the content that's being put out in comics now, while it's popular, is going to run up against all sorts of problems if minors are seen purchasing it. And so comic stores start to de-incentivize younger readers from coming into the store. And I would say that a lot of younger folks, and I experienced some of this even in the mid-'80s when I was like 15, 16 years old. Younger folks coming into comic stores, it was often a relatively hostile environment in a lot of ways, because these were not folks who wanted kids around. Half the time it was a store that, dealt in adult books as well or whatever, or it was a store that didn't want to get in trouble, and so they just didn't want kids in there at all. When you look at the other things too, besides discouraging younger folks and variants, dark and edgy is the lesson a lot of people take away from some of these great books. So even Born Again, when you look at it, it's a much darker, a much more psychological, a much more grounded approach. In the hands of a Frank Miller or an Alan Moore, these are deconstructions of the comic form, or they are deep looks at how someone could, turn out to try and help, but their vigilante actions turn them into being a little bit of a monster, right? But the takeaway a lot of people got from them was that violent and edgy and antisocial sold, and all they knew how to do was add more blood and sex without really adding the actual context. So a lot of the really terrible comics of the late 80s and early 90s, you can track back to these masterpieces of 1986. My takeaway essentially is that 1986 was a absolutely monumental year for comics in good ways and in bad ways. But if you did like almost like a graph showing the high point of what I would call classic white guy comics, right? 1986 has to be at or near the summit of that. I would say, in fact, that for what would be, the kinds of comics that guys like me traditionally like, 1986 is the summit. Now, I would argue that if a person keeps reading into modern days, the output of comics in the 21st century, and especially in the last 5 to 10 years, has been in many ways far better. But it's very different. So, this was the summit of the modern age of comics. If you think of the modern age basically as the time from 1980 when the Bronze Age ended through to sort of when comic books crashed and nearly died in the late 90s. I think 86 is your high point.
Right. This was a big episode. Thank you. If you've listened all the way to this point, thank you so much for hanging with us through all this. I think you realized just how much there was here to get through. And so thank you for hanging on all the way through the end. This was really interesting to me, Dan. I did not realize just how big a year 1986 was. And I'm glad that I now got an opportunity to see everything that was going on and then getting a chance to read one of those signature series that I keep hearing so much about.
This was a lot of fun. It also is probably the year I've left out the most on when talking about the year in comics stuff. There were easily another 5 or 10 things that would have been a major bullet point in previous years that I just had to leave out for lack of time. So, also, Editor Dan here at the end of the episode is going to probably make the look at, I don't know if I'll be able to edit this entire thing in time to get it out this week, so you may get a 2-part episode. So if you're listening to this as part 2, I really appreciate you sticking with me and letting me break this in half, because I think that's going to be easier on me and maybe easier on you, dear listener. So we'll see how it goes.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.